They told you it was just a coincidence, you meeting the narcissist. But what if it wasn't? What if that encounter, as painful and confusing as it was the beginning of a mission your soul accepted long before you ever took your first breath? You weren't sent here to live an ordinary life. You were sent here in silence, carrying a light that even you didn't fully understand. That narcissist wasn't just a villain in your story. They were a gatekeeper, guarding something, someone, a fallen angel, a soul once radiant, now shattered, hidden behind manipulation, control and lies. And only someone like you, an empath, a chosen one, had the power to walk through that darkness without becoming it. But why you? Why now? And what happens when the silent rescuer begins to awaken to their true role in this divine setup? Stay with me to the end, because by the time this ends, you'll realize your pain was never punishment, it was preparation. And if any part of you feels this message burning deep in your spirit, don't just watch. Comment below, "I hear the call," and hit subscribe, because your journey is far from over. It's just beginning. They never told you how it would feel, how one day everything around you would look the same. But something inside you would shift, quietly, without warning. You'd be sitting in your room, walking through a crowd, smiling politely at someone you barely know, and suddenly you'd feel it, that whisper, that pull, not in your ears, not in your head, but deeper, buried in your bones, in your spirit. You didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't loud, it didn't shout, it didn't demand, it called, softly, patiently, like a memory that had been waiting for you to come home. And for a while you tried to ignore it. You kept doing what everyone else was doing, smiling when it hurt, staying when it felt hollow, pretending when your soul was screaming, because you didn't have the words yet. You didn't know what was happening. You only knew that life as it was no longer made sense. Everything felt off. People drained you, conversations felt fake. You began to see through things through people, their masks, their performances, and the more you noticed, the lonelier it got. But here's the thing, the loneliness wasn't punishment. It was a sign, a signal. Something was waking up inside you. You were being summoned, not with trumpets, not with visions or dreams or thunder from the sky, but with stillness, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels full, like it's waiting for you to remember. You were never meant to blend in. That ache in your chest every time you saw injustice, cruelty, fake smiles, that wasn't weakness. That was your compass. That was your soul telling you you're not here for this. You were sent here for something deeper, a mission, a calling, a silent contract you made long before you ever took form, a promise sealed in light, that when the time came, when darkness crept in, you would remember, you would awaken, and you would go, not because you were forced, but because you chose to. But awakening doesn't come with instructions. It starts with confusion, pain, emotional earthquakes that shatter everything you thought was real. Friendships fall apart, relationships reveal their true colors. The narcissist enters your life, not as a villain in a cape, but wrapped in charm, beauty, attention. You almost fell. Maybe you did fall. But that fall was sacred, because in falling, you found the crack in the illusion. You saw what others couldn't, what others refused to. The narcissist wasn't just a person, they were the test. A guardian standing between you and your real assignment. And somewhere behind that pain was a soul, a fallen angel. Someone whose light had been buried, broken, manipulated, and left to rot in silence. And somehow you could feel them. You didn't know why, you didn't know how, but something in you refused to walk away. And that was the proof. You were the one who didn't run from pain, the one who didn't turn their back when things got dark. The one who was sent not to fight with swords or shouts, but with truth, with presence, with love that doesn't need to speak to be heard. This wasn't about romance. It wasn't about being stronger or more spiritual. This was about remembering who you are, why you're here, and what's been pulling at you all this time. The silent summons was never meant to be obvious, because it was never meant for everyone. Only the few could feel it. The ones who've cried in silence and still chose to love, the ones who've been broken and still chose to heal others, the ones who were abandoned and still stayed behind to help someone else cross. You were chosen. Not because you were perfect, but because you were willing. Willing to feel it all. Willing to lose what was fake. Willing to walk into shadows if it meant pulling one more soul into the light. And now, here you are, again, at first, cautiously, then freely. You look in the mirror and start to recognize the person staring back. Not the one they created, not the one they manipulated, but you, the real you, the powerful you, the empath who is no longer afraid to speak, the soul who now knows the difference between love and possession, between kindness and self-abandonment, between forgiveness and access. And now you walk differently, not bitter, not broken, but wise, with eyes that see through the charm, with a heart that trusts itself, with boundaries that don't need defending, only enforcing. And this is what they never expected, that the same person they tried to control would one day become untouchable, that the one they underestimated would become the very mirror they could no longer face. You were never weak. You were never naive. You were simply under a spell. But now that it's broken, now that you've returned to yourself, nothing and no one can put you back in that prison again. You know too much. You feel too deeply. And your healing is your revolution. It speaks louder than any revenge. It shines brighter than any comeback. Because it's not about proving anything to them. It's about remembering everything about you. You don't have to fight anymore. You already won. You broke the spell. And now you are free. There is a kind of strength the world rarely sees, because it doesn't shout, it doesn't fight, and it doesn't demand to be noticed. It's the kind of strength that sits in silence, breathes through storms, and listens for what others are too distracted to hear. It's the strength that doesn't rush, because it knows. And that strength, that sacred, unshakable power, has always lived inside of you. You weren't made for chaos, even though you've walked through it. You weren't made for noise, even though you've heard a lifetime of screaming souls. You were made for stillness, not as an escape, but as a tool, a portal, a sacred space where the broken begin to heal, where the fallen begin to feel again, because stillness is not empty. Stillness is not weak. Stillness is preparation. You knew this long before you had words for it. You could sense when something was about to shift, not because someone told you, but because your spirit whispered it in quiet moments. And when the fallen angel came into your life, shattered behind a flawless smile, lost behind eyes that had once seen heaven, you didn't panic, you felt. You didn't try to fix them, you simply held space. You didn't lead with noise, you led with presence. And they followed, not because you forced them, but because your stillness reminded them of something they'd forgotten. The light, the peace, the place inside themselves they had buried under shame, ego, rage, and fear. You didn't need to preach. You didn't need to explain. Your calm was the message. Because in a world addicted to performance, your quiet authenticity was rebellion, and it woke something in them. They came to you broken. though they'd never admit it. They had worn the costume of strength for so long, even they had forgotten it was just armor. But your stillness disarmed them. Your presence revealed everything they tried to hide, because that's what true stillness does. It mirrors, it reflects, it reveals, and for the first time in lifetimes they were seen, not as a role, not as a title, not as a weapon, but as a soul, wounded, wandering, but still divine. And that terrified them, because when you live in noise, silence feels like death. But you were the opposite. You were life, quiet, intentional, holy. You became the pause between their patterns, the breath between their battles. And even when they resisted, even when they tried to sabotage the connection because it was too real, you remained rooted. Not because you were perfect, not because you had all the answers, but because your stillness wasn't passive. It was powered by something deeper, something ancient, something they couldn't name but couldn't walk away from either. You became their tether, the lighthouse when their wings forgot how to fly. But here's what makes you rare. You didn't lose yourself trying to lead them. You didn't drain your soul trying to pour into theirs. You knew the path home wasn't something you could walk for them. It was something you could only light beside them. And so you stood, calm, unmoving, trusting the timing, trusting the process, trusting yourself. Because the empath who has mastered stillness is no longer prey. They are the guide. They are the one who no longer needs to chase truth, they embody it. You began to understand that healing was never about loud awakenings or dramatic breakdowns. Sometimes healing sounds like a deep breath, like closing your eyes and finally feeling safe inside your own skin, like letting the fallen angels sit next to you, broken and confused, without needing to rescue them, because you finally know your energy is the rescue, your presence is the remedy. Transformation. It cannot be carried. It must be chosen. And you, beautiful soul, can now move forward, not with regret, but with reverence. You didn't fail. You fulfilled your role with grace, even when it broke your heart. You became the mirror, the pause in the noise, the holy space where a fallen soul saw themselves, maybe for the first time in lifetimes. And that is a miracle. So if you still feel their echo, if their energy still lingers, it's not because you're bound, it's because your soul once heard the ache of theirs and answered. You did what only you could do. And now your mission continues. Because you didn't come here to save just one. You came here to remind many. And the echo that once haunted you, it no longer calls for rescue. It now sings of remembrance. Because even fallen angels, when seen with love, remember how to fly. And you, dear soul, are the reason they'll try. You didn't know it was a spell, not at first. It didn't feel like control, it felt like connection. It felt like warmth in the cold, like someone finally saw you. It felt like being chosen. But that's how it always begins. Not with chains, but with charm. Not with commands, but with compliments. They didn't storm into your life, they seeped into it, like smoke, like a whispered dream you almost didn't notice. Slowly, piece by piece, they wrapped themselves around your soul. At first, it looked like love. But underneath it all was a hunger, a deep, bottomless need to be adored, worshipped, obeyed. And the more you gave, the more they took. They fed off your empathy like it was oxygen. They used your compassion against you, twisting your patience into permission, your silence into submission. You started questioning yourself. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you were overreacting. Maybe it was your fault. That was the spell, making you believe their cruelty was your burden to fix. And for a long time, you carried it. You bent over backwards. You became smaller, quieter, more agreeable. You softened your truth to protect their ego. You walked on eggshells just to keep the peace. But deep inside, something sacred was stirring. A voice, a knowing. Faint at first, like a whisper from a forgotten part of your soul. You ignored it. You weren't ready. But the spell was cracking. Every lie they told, every moment they made you doubt your reality, every time you had to apologize just for existing, it all chipped away at the illusion they had so carefully built around you. And then one day, the voice was louder than the noise. It didn't scream. It simply said, "This is not love." And in that moment, something in you snapped, not in rage, but in remembrance. You remembered who you were before they rewrote your story. You remembered what peace felt like before it had to be negotiated. You remembered the sound of your own voice before it was silenced. That moment was your awakening. The moment you realized that their power only existed because you kept handing it to them. And so with trembling hands and a heart that still wanted to believe in their goodness, you took it back. Not all at once, but moment by moment, boundary by boundary, truth by truth. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped trying to make them understand. You stopped shrinking to fit inside the box they built to contain you. And with each small act of self-reclamation, the spell weakened. They could feel it. They tried harder. Love bombing, guilt tripping, gaslighting, the same old tactics dressed in desperate new forms, because narcissists don't know how to release control. They panic when their illusion starts to fade. But you didn't panic. You paused. You breathed. You remembered. And in that remembrance, you found a strength you didn't know was yours, a quiet, ancient kind of strength, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that simply knows. You stopped responding to their chaos. You stopped justifying your intuition. You looked them in the eye, not with anger, but with clarity. And that was the moment everything shifted, because narcissists can't survive clarity. They thrive in confusion. They survive in shadows. But your light, your calm, unwavering, silent light, became their undoing. They saw it in your posture, in your refusal to chase, in the way your energy no longer bent toward their storms, and in that moment they lost their grip. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped fighting at all. You stopped playing the game. You left the stage. You rewrote the script. And the spell, once so strong it shaped your entire world, shattered. But breaking the spell doesn't mean the pain disappears overnight. The aftermath is real. The silence is loud. The healing is messy. You grieve, not just them, but the version of you that stayed so long. You grieve the hope, the effort, the love you poured into someone who only saw it as fuel for control. But you also rise. You begin to notice the weight lifting. You breathe differently. You laugh. Didn't know that beneath the surface of their smile lived centuries of sorrow, layered grief, and the quiet desperation of a soul that had forgotten how to sing. What you met was not a person. It was an echo. A haunting call that had been moving through realms, waiting for the one soul strong enough, soft enough, brave enough to hear it. That soul was you. You didn't know it then, but the moment you met them, something inside you stirred, something ancient, something sacred. You didn't fall in love in the way stories describe it. You fell into recognition, into remembrance, into a soul contract that was written long before you arrived on this earth. They had fallen long before you, fallen from grace, from hope, from self-worth, fallen into a world that never understood them. And so they hid, behind masks, behind sharp edges, behind silence that sounded like strength. But the silence wasn't strength, it was screaming, just not in a way the world could hear. But you heard it. You always heard what others missed, because your heart wasn't designed for the surface. It was tuned to frequencies that required stillness to hear. And when you listened, really listened, you began to hear the truth, that their soul had been crying for lifetimes, not just from pain, but from isolation, from the unbearable weight of being unseen. And your presence, your quiet, patient, sacred presence, was the answer they never thought would come. You didn't rush them, you didn't push, you didn't demand they open up, you simply stayed. And in that staying, they began to unravel, not in chaos, but in surrender, because something in you made them feel safe, not because you had the answers, but because you didn't need them to perform. You didn't need them to impress you. You only needed them to be. And for someone who had spent their entire life trying to become what everyone else needed, that was the first taste of freedom. But here's what no one tells you. Answering the call of a fallen soul is not a fairy tale. It's not poetic. It's not always beautiful. Sometimes it's brutal. Because when you reach for someone who has fallen, they may pull you down before they let you pull them up. And you felt that. You felt the weight of their fear, their resistance, their inner war. They couldn't believe someone would stay, not without an agenda, not without trying to fix them or flee. So they tested you, pushed you, hurt you, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to receive love without expecting it to disappear. And yet, you stayed. Not to save them, but because your soul recognized the mission. They were the echo you were born to hear, the cry you were meant to answer. And every time they tried to bury their light, you gently reminded them it was still there. Not by preaching, not by healing, but simply by holding space. The kind of space that says, you don't have to earn love, you just have to exist. And slowly, they began to soften. The mask slipped, the walls cracked, and through those cracks you caught glimpses of who they truly were beneath the pain, a soul that once burned with light, purpose, and music. A being who had loved deeply and been betrayed even deeper. An angel not in mythology but in mission. A spirit who once carried light until the world convinced them it was safer to be numb. And as you saw them, they began to see themselves. But here's the truth few want to admit. Not every fallen angel wants to rise. Some are so used to the dark that the light feels blinding. Some are so attached to their pain that healing feels like death. And you, empath, warrior, soul-tethered guide, you had to make the hardest choice of all, to love them, without losing yourself. Because even though you answered the call, you were never meant to stay in the pit. You were meant to remind, to reflect, to awaken, but not to carry, not to bleed for someone else's becoming. And maybe that's what they couldn't understand, that your silence wasn't weakness, it was listening, that your stillness wasn't passivity, it was discernment, that your leaving wasn't betrayal, it was self-rescue, because eventually you heard a second echo, the sound of your own spirit asking to be remembered, and you knew then that answering their call was only half the mission. The rest was answering yours. So you stepped back, maybe you walked away, maybe you stayed close but created distance. But however it happened, you reclaimed yourself. And it hurt. God, it hurt. Because you didn't just leave them, you left the part of you that believed your purpose was to fix what was never yours to heal. But what happened next was sacred. The echoes faded. Not because they stopped calling, but because you had finally answered. You did what you came to do. You saw them. You reminded them. You awakened something ancient in a soul that had long forgotten its own name. And now they must rise on their own. Because that is the nature of true pride, and that's what terrified them. You saw too much without needing them to explain anything. You didn't play their games because you already knew how they ended. Your stillness was not submission. It was strategy. It was your way of gathering information while others exposed themselves. You didn't confront, you revealed. You didn't explode, you understood. And in understanding, you disarmed them, because narcissists and manipulators thrive on confusion. They feed on reaction, but you didn't give them that satisfaction. You stayed grounded even when they tried to shake you. You stayed calm even when they provoked you. You let them believe they were winning because they mistook your quiet for surrender. But what they didn't know was that you were simply observing, gathering truth, watching them build the very case that would undo them, not in court, not in confrontation, but in consciousness, in time, in spirit. Because while they needed a crowd to feel powerful, you only needed clarity. You were never out to destroy anyone. That's not the empath's path, but when the time came, when their lies had stacked too high and their cruelty could no longer hide behind charm, you stood up, softly, firmly, without theatrics. And your truth was undeniable, not because you shouted it, but because it rang with the kind of quiet conviction that cannot be faked. They never saw it coming, because how could someone so gentle be so resolute? How could someone so compassionate set such unshakable boundaries? How could someone so quiet walk away with such loud finality? But you did, not with rage, not with revenge, but with clarity. You didn't slam doors, you closed them with grace. You didn't expose them to the world. You simply stopped explaining, stopped participating, stopped giving your light to those who only wanted to drain it. And in doing so, you taught the loudest lesson of all, that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it withdraws. Sometimes it chooses peace over proving a point. And that is what they could never predict, that you had been building this strength all along, in the shadows, in the silences, in the moments you cried behind closed doors, and still chose to rise the next morning with love in your chest. Your silence had been training you. Every time you swallowed your scream to keep peace. Every time you walked away instead of fighting a pointless battle. Every time you chose compassion over chaos. You weren't just surviving, you were sharpening. And now they don't know what to do with you, because you no longer flinch at manipulation. You no longer chase people who misunderstand your quiet. You no longer allow access to those who can't honor your depth. Your silence is no longer self-doubt, it's self-mastery, and you carry it like a crown. You've become the warrior they didn't see coming, the one who doesn't fight to be right, but stands in what is, the one who doesn't need revenge, because peace was the goal all along. You learn to listen not just to words, but to energy, to the way people shift when truth is near, to the vibration behind their voice, to your own intuition, which had been speaking all along. You learned that silence isn't the absence of power, it's the container for it. That in stillness, the truth becomes loud. That in pausing, clarity is born. That when you stop trying to explain your soul to people who are committed to misunderstanding it, you create space for your real life to begin. You now walk with quiet confidence. You no longer need to be seen to feel valid. You no longer need to prove your worth to those who can't perceive it. You are whole, not because someone finally understood you, but because you finally stopped needing them to. You understand yourself now. And that has made you unstoppable. You've become the empathic warrior. The light bringer who doesn't blind others, but simply refuses to dim anymore. The soul who doesn't need an audience, but stands firmly in alignment. The one who doesn't fear the narcissist's tactics because you've seen the worst of them and still chose love. You chose growth. You chose you. And from now on, you move differently. Not out of fear, but from wisdom. Not in reaction, but from revelation. You no longer waste energy proving the sun exists to those who have chosen to live in the dark. You simply rise every day in silence, in strength, in peace. And that is your silent strategy. That is your superpower. That is who you've become. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They arrive silently, like whispers in the dark. Subtle at first, easy to miss. But when you look back, you realize those were the moments that changed everything. The first time you saw them, it felt familiar. Not in the way of memory, but in the way souls remember each other across lifetimes. Something about their eyes, or maybe the silence between their words, made your heart pause. You didn't know who they were, not yet. Every betrayal, they cracked the surface just enough to let your real self rise. You began to remember who you were before the conditioning, before the shame, before you believed that love must be earned through pain. You began to rise, not with vengeance, but with clarity. You saw the game for what it was, the push-pull, the gaslighting, the subtle jabs that always left you questioning yourself. And suddenly, you stopped dancing, you stopped chasing, you stopped needing them to validate your worth. And in that moment, that sacred moment, the power shifted. They could feel it. They could feel the silence growing louder than your begging ever was. They could feel the distance you created, not physically, but spiritually. And that terrified them. Because narcissists feed on energy and yours was no longer on the menu. But walking away wasn't easy. It felt like death, the death of a dream, the death of who you used to be, the death of the illusion that they ever loved you in the way you deserved. But sometimes you have to die to be reborn. Sometimes you have to walk through hell to discover the heaven within. And you did. You walked through the fire, you cried on the floor, you lost yourself. And then you found your soul. And as the smoke cleared, you saw the lesson written in the ashes. You are not weak. You were never weak. You were just too loving, too hopeful, too full of light for someone who only knew how to live in the dark. But even in the darkness, you learned. You learned what betrayal really feels like. Not just from others, but the betrayal of abandoning yourself for the comfort of someone else. You learned the difference between attachment and love, between power and partnership, between being chosen and being used. And most of all, you learned that your softness is not a flaw, it's a superpower. The narcissist taught you how sacred your light really is, by trying to snuff it out. They taught you how to build boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. They taught you how to say no more, not in anger, but in love for yourself. And that strength, that raw, quiet, rooted strength was always inside you. It just needed a reason to wake up. And now you carry it, not like armor, but like a reminder. A reminder that you made it out. That you faced one of the most manipulative forms of spiritual warfare and still held onto your soul. That even when someone tried to rewrite your story, you picked up the pen and wrote the truth in bold ink. You're not who you were before them. You're wiser, softer, sharper. You now see the red flags as warnings, not challenges. You listen to your gut the first time. You don't mistake chaos for chemistry. And you no longer try to prove your worth to anyone who refuses to see it. That is the gift inside the grief, the wisdom inside the wound, the lesson inside the darkness. You don't thank the narcissist, you don't excuse them, but you acknowledge the role they played. Not as a lover, not as a friend, but as a mirror A mirror that showed you where you still needed healing. A mirror that cracked so you could finally see yourself clearly. And now, as you rise piece by piece, light by light, you understand something most never will. Your greatest teacher wasn't the one who held you in love. It was the one who tried to destroy you and failed, because in that failure, you were forged. In that pain, you were purified. In that heartbreak, you were reborn. And you, my dear soul, are not broken. You are not bitter. You are becoming the kind of person no narcissist can ever touch again. Becoming the kind of soul that protects its peace like a sacred temple. Becoming the kind of light that doesn't just shine, but burns away every lie you were ever told about who you are. This is your story. This is your strength. This is your lesson in darkness. And now, it's your turn to teach. They mistook your silence for weakness. They saw the way you observed instead of reacted, how you listened without interrupting, and how you held your emotions like sacred water, still but deep. And because the world had taught them that power looks loud, dominant, explosive, they assumed you were powerless. They couldn't have been more wrong. What they didn't know, what they could never see through their noise and bravado, was that your silence wasn't empty. It was ancient, it was strategic, it was the armor you forged in lifetimes of spiritual warfare. You didn't just survive chaos, you learned to navigate it without a map. While they threw words like daggers and twisted facts into weapons, you watched, you felt, you waited, because as an empath, your greatest strength was never in matching volume, it was in sensing truth beneath the noise. You didn't need to shout to be right. You didn't need to win arguments to know what was real. You could feel when someone's energy betrayed their words. You could detect the cracks in their voice, the tension in their jaw, the fear behind that threatens its illusion is seen as an enemy, and your compassion, your sacred, golden, soul-born compassion, became the biggest threat of all. That was the moment the war reached its climax, the moment you saw the truth so clearly it cut you, the moment you stopped trying to fix them and started fighting for yourself. It was the most painful shift because walking away doesn't just feel like losing them, it feels like betraying the part of you that always believes people can change. But some people don't want to change. Some people want to be worshipped more than they want to be loved. And you, empath, are not here to be anyone's altar. You're not here to bleed in hopes they'll grow. You're not here to bow to an illusion. You're here to embody love, but love that includes yourself. And so, the war ended, not with noise, but with a decision. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You simply chose you. You walked away, not because you didn't care, but because you finally did. You stopped watering someone's ego and started nurturing your own healing. And in that quiet act of choosing yourself, your soul whispered, you won. Not because they admitted they were wrong, not because they apologized, but because you didn't let the war harden you, because you left with your softness intact, because your heart, though bruised, still believes in truth, still believes in depth, still believes in love. And that is what makes you powerful, not the war, not the pain, but the fact that you walked through fire and came out more yourself than ever before. The empath and the ego may clash, but they will never be equal, because ego can manipulate, ego can demand, ego can wear a crown made of mirrors, but only love can transform, only love can build, only love can heal. And you, dear empath, are love, in its rarest, most sacred form. So never regret the war. It showed you what your heart was capable of. And never fear meeting another ego. Now you know the signs. Now you know the cost. And now, most importantly, you know this. Your compassion is not a weakness. Your boundaries are not cruelty. and your love is not up for consumption. It's a sacred offering, meant only for those who come to you without masks and with hearts ready to rise. You thought you knew pain until you met them. The narcissist didn't show up as a villain. They came as a lesson dressed in longing, cloaked in charm, disguised as everything you ever thought you needed. In the beginning, you mistook their intensity for connection, their obsession for love, and their praise for sincerity. But slowly, you began to feel it, the subtle shift, the emotional tightening, the invisible leash they were wrapping around your soul. And yet, you didn't run. You stayed, because you were taught to be kind, to understand, to be patient. You told yourself they were just wounded, that they didn't mean to hurt you, that if you just loved them enough, maybe they'd finally change. But what you didn't know then, what you were never prepared for, was that this wasn't just a relationship. It was a spiritual initiation, a descent into the underworld of your own heart, a journey into the very roots of your identity. And the narcissist, they were the shadow guide. They came into your life not to love you, but to expose you, to show you everything you didn't yet know about yourself, not through kindness, but through cruelty, not through clarity, but through chaos, not through presence, but through their repeated absence, even when they were standing right next to you. Because that's the thing about narcissists, they aren't just people, they're mirrors, broken mirrors. And when you look into them, you don't just see them, you see yourself, distorted, scattered, desperate for validation you never should have been begging for. You start to wonder when you stopped recognizing your own reflection. You can't remember the last time you spoke your truth without editing it for their comfort. You can't recall the last time you felt safe, soft, or seen. And yet you try harder. You give more. You quiet your intuition. You silence your spirit just to keep the peace. But the peace never lasts. Because narcissists don't want love, they want control. And every time you give more of yourself, they tighten their grip. You begin to lose your sparkle. You start doubting your worth. You carry their moods, their rage, their projections as if they were your own. You start apologizing for your existence. But deep down, beneath all the confusion and pain, a voice is whispering, "This is not love." You try to hush it. You try to convince yourself you're overreacting. But the voice grows louder. It begins to echo in your bones. And that's when it begins, not the ending, but the awakening. Because what the narcissist didn't know is that while they were trying to break you, they were actually activating you. With every lie, they pushed you toward your truth. With every manipulation, they forced you to sharpen your discernment. With guarded just as fiercely. So you stepped back. You breathed. You recentered. And something beautiful happened. You realized that guarding someone's healing doesn't mean carrying it. You are the reminder, not the rescuer. You are the presence, not the pressure. You are the witness, not the weight. And that balance, that sacred dance, became your freedom and theirs. Because the moment you stopped trying to hold their wings in place, they began to grow back. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but truly. And maybe that's the miracle. Not that you saved them, but that you saw them. That you stood in front of what the world called broken and whispered, "I see your light." Even now, that you didn't run from the chaos of their healing, but met it with stillness, that you didn't flinch when their darkness tried to convince you they were unlovable. You stayed long enough for them to feel safe in their own skin again. That is guardianship. That is sacred love. That is purpose. And now, even if they never say it, even if they never fully understand it, their soul remembers. Somewhere deep inside, they know Someone once saw their wings when no one else could. Someone once loved their shadow without fear. Someone once believed in their light, even when it had gone out. And that someone was you. You didn't ask for war. You never wanted to battle anyone. You came with an open heart, with soft hands and listening eyes, with a soul that spoke the language of compassion and healing. All you ever wanted was to understand, to connect, to love purely. But what happens when that compassion, the very thing that makes you beautiful, becomes the battlefield for someone else's ego? What happens when your love is seen not as a gift, but as an opportunity to control, to dominate, to feed a hollow place in someone who doesn't want healing, only admiration? This is the war no one warned you about. The one where your heart, with all its sacred softness, collides with someone who worships only themselves. And it doesn't happen suddenly. It begins slowly, subtly, with charm, with attention, with everything you thought love was supposed to look like. They mirror your dreams, they echo your pain, they wear a mask so polished even your intuition begins to second-guess itself. They don't confront you with cruelty, not at first. They seduce you with understanding, with vulnerability that feels real, until it's used against you. You share your soul with them, and they take notes. You bleed your truth, and they memorize the blueprint of your heart, so they can twist it later. That's the thing about ego. It's always hungry, always watching, and when it meets an empath, it sees a feast. You see potential, they see supply, and the war begins before you even realize you're in it. It's not a war of fists or fire. It's psychological, energetic. You give, they take. You explain, they twist. You apologize for simply feeling. You start shrinking, reshaping, doubting your own intuition just to keep the peace. And still it's never enough, because the ego doesn't want peace. The ego wants control. The ego wants worship. And you, dear empath, you were born to connect, not to obey. Your soul seeks truth, while theirs clings to illusion. You long to go deep, but their ego only plays on the surface, where it can be admired without ever being truly seen. You begin to notice the patterns, the way they change the subject when you express pain, the way your joy threatens them, the way your silence angers them even more than your words. They need to be the center, always. And you, who once offered your heart freely, begin to feel like a shadow of yourself, confused, exhausted, hollow. Because you're loving someone who doesn't want to be loved, they want to be worshipped. And worship is not the same as love. Love holds space. Worship suffocates. Love invites truth. Ego fears it. Love asks, "Who are you really?" Ego demands, "What can you do for me?" And still you stayed, not because you were weak, not because you didn't see, but because you hoped. You saw a flicker of something more behind their armor, a child, a wound, a ghost of someone who once needed love and never got it. And you thought, maybe your compassion could be the key. Maybe if you loved harder, softer, longer, deeper, they would finally feel safe enough to let the mask fall. But you forgot something sacred. Love is not force. You can't love someone into awakening. You can't hug the ego out of someone who chooses to stay asleep. You can show up. You can pour out. You can speak light into the darkest corners of their soul. But at some point, you have to realize they don't want the light, because the light reveals too much. It exposes what they've spent years hiding, even from themselves. And the more you shine, the more they fight to dim you, the more they twist your kindness into guilt, your strength into selfishness, your boundaries into betrayal, because to the ego, anything. Moment you looked at them and felt something shift in your spirit. You couldn't explain it. It wasn't romantic and it wasn't ordinary. It was deeper, older, like your soul recognized something that your mind couldn't yet process. You weren't falling in love, you were falling into purpose. At first, you thought you could handle it. You told yourself you were just being a good listener, a kind friend, a compassionate soul. But somewhere deep down, you knew this was different. Their pain didn't just reach you, it clung to you. And not because they asked you to carry it, but because your spirit volunteered, without words, without promises, without hesitation. You began to see what others couldn't. Not just the cracks in their armor, but the wounds beneath the armor, the bruises behind their laughter, the darkness behind their eyes. You started to notice the way they flinched at kindness, the way they couldn't receive love without preparing for it to be ripped away, the way they kept trying to sabotage anything that felt too real. And then it hit you. This person wasn't cold, they weren't careless, they weren't cruel, they were wounded, wounded in ways you had no map for, wounded in ways that made them believe love was dangerous and safety was a trap. You saw a soul that had once been radiant, maybe even divine, who had crashed into this world and forgotten how to fly. A fallen angel, not a fantasy, not a myth, but a real being, standing in front of you, terrified to be seen. Someone who had lost their wings, not because they were evil, but because life, people, betrayal and trauma had ripped those wings off piece by piece. And for some reason, you could see it. You could see them. And no matter how much they pushed you away, you stayed, because you weren't just a friend, you weren't just someone passing through. You were something else entirely. A guardian. Not the kind with swords and shields, but the kind who holds space in silence, the kind who sits beside shattered pieces without rushing to fix them. The kind who knows that healing doesn't come from control, but from presence, from witnessing. You became the first person who didn't try to change them. You didn't tell them to get over it. You didn't label them as broken. You didn't offer shallow solutions. You sat with them, in the dark, in the silence, in the places where no one else dared to stay. And that's when the truth settled in your chest like a sacred weight. You were sent, not to rescue, not to fix, not to force transformation, but to guard, to hold sacred the light that still lived beneath their pain, to shield it from the storms, to protect it from further harm, to believe in it even when they didn't. You weren't there to preach or heal or lead them somewhere they weren't ready to go. You were there to show them, maybe for the first time in their life, that love could exist without strings. That safety didn't always come with control, that being fully seen didn't always mean being judged. And slowly, so slowly, they began to soften. They didn't say much, maybe they never did, but the walls didn't go up as fast. The silence between you started to feel sacred, not scary. You began to see flickers of light in their eyes again, tiny sparks like stars blinking back into existence after being lost in the night sky. And in those moments you realized, this is why your path was filled with pain. This is why you went through the heartbreak, the confusion, the seasons where you questioned your own worth. It was never a punishment, it was preparation. Because only someone who had known darkness could sit in it without fear. Only someone who had been broken could understand what it meant to feel unfixable. Only someone who had lost their own wings at some point could recognize what it meant to carry invisible scars. You were not chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because you were willing. And that willingness, that quiet devotion, became the softest kind of miracle. You began to notice how they stopped apologizing for existing, how they started speaking without filtering their truth, how they smiled without caution, how they began to feel again. Not because you healed them, but because you gave them the space to remember who they were. And isn't that what true love is? Not forcing someone to change, but standing beside them as they return to their original design, as they reclaim the light that was always theirs. But let's be honest, it wasn't easy. There were days when you questioned everything, when you wondered if you were losing yourself in the process, when your own wounds resurfaced and begged for attention. You felt exhausted, unseen, stretched to the edge of your limits, because even guardians get tired. And that's when you had to learn something even deeper, that being a guardian doesn't mean abandoning yourself, that your softness needs shelter too, that your light deserves to be too sensitive. You'll never be enough. And yet, despite all of that, something in you remembered, something ancient, something divine, a whisper in your spirit that said, this isn't the end, this is the beginning. So you didn't give up. You started digging, peeling back the lies, unlearning the false stories they told you. And through every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, your true self began to rise. The chosen one, the healer, the light bringer, the guardian of the forgotten. And then you saw it. The one behind the narcissist, the soul they tried to steal, the light they tried to smother. Maybe it was a person you were meant to help. Maybe it was a community you were born to lead. Maybe it was a voice inside of you that had been waiting to be heard. Whatever it was, it began to rise. Because you finally passed the test. You met the gatekeeper and you didn't bow. You stood tall even when they tried to destroy you. You chose truth even when it cost you everything. You walked away, not in bitterness, but in silent power. That's what being chosen means. It doesn't mean you were spared pain. It means you were trusted with it, because pain births purpose, darkness sharpens discernment, and betrayal, it carves the path straight to your soul's assignment. You were sent to save a fallen angel, but first you had to meet the narcissist. And now that you have, you're ready? Not just to rescue, but to remember. To remember why you came here. To remember the strength you forgot. To remember that no force, not even the narcissist, can stop a soul who's been called. You didn't come here to beg for love. You didn't come here to shrink, to please, or to stay silent. You came here to awaken, and through that awakening, to call others out of their sleep. So if you've met the narcissist, if you've felt the confusion, the soul-deep exhaustion, the emptiness behind their eyes, know this: you weren't cursed. You were chosen to see through the illusion, to feel what others numb, to remember what others forget. And now that you've passed through the gate, there's a soul waiting on the other side. Maybe it's yours, maybe it's someone else's, but either way, it's time to fly. They didn't enter your life with horns. No red flags waved the first time they smiled. No thunder cracked the sky when they touched your soul. In fact, they seemed like everything you had been praying for. Kind, attentive, magnetic. They mirrored your dreams, reflected your deepest wounds, and studied your heart like a map they already knew. And because your soul was open, because your spirit was built to see the good in others, you let them in. Slowly, gently, without fear. But what you didn't know was that this was no ordinary meeting. This was a divine setup, because hidden beneath the charm, behind the soft words and intense stares, was an ancient pattern, a test. A soul who had forgotten their own light and now fed on the energy of others just to feel alive. They weren't just your lover, your friend, your leader. They were your first opposition. Not because they hated you, but because your light triggered what they were trying to bury. And the deeper you loved them, the more they began to fear you, because love, true love, is exposure. And what they wore was a mask crafted so perfectly that even you doubted your instincts. But eventually the cracks began to show. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the need to always win, to always be right. You began to shrink, to explain, to apologize for simply feeling. And even then, you stayed because you believed you could love the pain out of them. But the truth is, you weren't sent to save them. You were sent to recognize them, to remember them, because the narcissist wasn't the enemy. They were the mirror, the guardian at the first door, the masked obstacle that would teach you how to protect your own soul before you tried to carry someone else's. And once you saw through the mask, not with anger, but with clarity, you passed the first test of your calling. You didn't come here to be fooled. You came here to see. And once you saw them for who they truly were, you began to see yourself. Uncover the moment you realized the fallen angel wasn't a myth, but a wounded spirit in desperate need. You didn't know what you were walking into, not really. You thought it was just another connection, another soul crossing paths with yours, maybe for a season, maybe for a lesson. You thought the feelings that rose in your chest were just empathy, or maybe even attraction. But what you didn't yet understand was that this wasn't just a meeting, this was a summoning. You were being called. Not by words, not by logic, but by the faint, aching pull of a soul that had been crying out in silence for longer than anyone knew. A soul wrapped in flesh, walking through this world with invisible wounds and a smile that fooled everyone except you. And that's when it began. The still standing, still soft, still listening, still answering that call, maybe without even realizing that every time you chose compassion over revenge, silence over chaos, and truth over comfort, you were moving closer to your mission. This isn't the end. This is the beginning, the real beginning. So if any part of this echoed something deep inside you, something raw, something ancient, then know this: you're not broken, you're not lost, you're remembering. And that whisper you keep hearing? It's real. And it's calling you home. Why did you cross paths with the one who tried to steal their light before you even knew your task? There was a time in your life, before the awakening, before the unraveling, when everything seemed ordinary, predictable. Days blended into nights, and life felt like a routine you hadn't chosen, but had silently agreed to follow. You didn't know that destiny was already moving beneath the surface, aligning circumstances, pulling strings, and slowly guiding your steps towards something ancient, something sacred. And then you met them, the narcissist. But you didn't know they were one, not yet, not in the beginning. They came wrapped in charm, confidence, attention. Maybe they said all the right things, maybe they saw you in a way no one else did, or at least pretended to. And for a moment, you felt chosen, seen, important. It felt like fate. And in a way, it was. But not the kind of fate you thought, not the romantic kind, not the fairy tale kind. This was spiritual warfare disguised as chemistry. This was a divine test, cloaked in sweet words and calculated smiles. Because this person wasn't just an obstacle, they were a gatekeeper, stationed at the threshold of your real mission. They stood in front of the one you were meant to reach, the one whose soul had been silenced, whose light had been stolen, whose wings had been broken by lifetimes of pain. But before you could reach that wounded angel, you had to face the one who held the key to their prison. The narcissist didn't look like a villain at first. That's their gift. They mirror what you long to see. They studied your empathy like a blueprint. They mimicked your warmth, your dreams, your purpose. They became everything you didn't even know you were craving. And for a while, you believed it. Because your heart was pure. Because you wanted to believe love could heal all things, even them. But slowly, things began to shift. The light in your life dimmed. You started second-guessing yourself. You found yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, explaining yourself for simply feeling, suppressing your instincts just to keep the peace. You didn't understand why. All you knew was something was off. And beneath the confusion, a deeper ache began to grow. Not just from the manipulation or emotional games, but from something older, something spiritual. You were being blocked from a path you hadn't yet fully seen, from a soul you hadn't yet fully known. But the energy was real, the resistance was real, and the narcissist, whether they knew it consciously or not, was standing between you and the light you were born to restore. Because that fallen angel, the soul trapped in silence, they were connected to you. You had agreed, long before this lifetime, to find them, to help them remember who they were. But the narcissist, they had their own purpose too. They were placed at the door, not just to guard it, but to test you. Would you notice the manipulation? Would you trust your intuition when everything looked perfect on the outside? Would you speak your truth even when it made you the villain in their story? Would you walk away, not because you didn't care, but because you finally did? These were the questions that your soul came here to answer. You didn't meet the narcissist by accident. You met them because your power needed to be activated through fire, because before you could protect someone else's wings, you had to learn to protect your own. Before you could hold space for another's pain, you had to stop shrinking to fit inside someone else's illusion. The narcissist taught you in the most painful way possible how to stop abandoning yourself. And when you finally stepped away, whether it took months, years, or lifetimes, you didn't just leave a toxic relationship. You passed a sacred threshold. You unlocked the gate. And on the other side was them, the fallen angel, the one the narcissist was keeping hidden. Maybe it was their child. Maybe it was someone they had emotionally dominated. Maybe it was you, your own past self, the version of you that had been silenced and shamed and forgotten. Because sometimes the fallen angel isn't someone outside of us. Sometimes it's the piece of ourselves we had to abandon to survive. And the narcissist, they were the guard, standing over that version of you, making sure it never spoke again. They were the voice that told you, you're too much, you're